Hi there. You are listening to the Common Action Forum's monthly podcast, where we look for alternative narratives to shape a better world. I am Tristan Torrejon. It's Tuesday, the 19th of October, and for this edition, we want to take a look at the current circumstances in Afghanistan, going back to the complete US withdrawal last August, as well as to the start of the US invasion 20 years ago. And for that, we have Dr. Arlene Clemesha here with us. Good day, Arlene. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Tristan. It's great to talk to you.
CAF Executive Board Member Dr. Arlene Clemesha is a renowned Brazilian academician, TV commentator, and professor at the Center of Arab Studies of the São Paulo University. An expert on contemporary Arab history, she has written extensively about Middle East conflicts. Between 2005 and 2015, she was a member of the Coordination Committee of the UN International Coordinating Network on Palestine. So, Arlene, after weeks of constant media coverage, Western interest in Afghanistan has finally started to dwindle, let's say. We've witnessed all sorts of dramatic scenes, and yet the Taliban regime still claims no one has nothing to fear, downplaying the summary executions that have already happened and the fact that women still cannot go back to their jobs. But Afghanistan is in the middle of a grave economic and humanitarian crisis, and Western countries so far have refused to channel aid. We keep asking ourselves if the Taliban government is going to be any different from the one in the 90s, but can they really afford to be the same, given the circumstances?
Well, that's precisely the question. You know, what you've outlined there is the idea that maybe through foreign aid, through promises of engagement with the Taliban government, which is in need of international recognition and of investment to be able to run the country, if maybe they could be in any way pressured to concede to those issues of respect to human rights, women's rights, and so forth. However, we do have to see that the Taliban is a very diverse group with many inner divisions, and that probably explains the initial declarations trying to guarantee that they would form and conduct a different government from the one in the 1990s. But it is the old guard leading the cabinet, and that we do have to keep in mind. Not only is it the old guard leading the cabinet, but they are the victors in this situation. You know, those who resisted for 20 years against U.S. occupation, military occupation, those who have managed to, you know, in a way expel the U.S. not only from Afghanistan, but in some sense changing the whole foreign policy for the region, you know, announcing the end of military occupations in the region. So, you know, why would they change? The legitimacy that they gained inside the country really drives them to a position of probably not being in any way forced to change or concede and so on. Now, this is very alarming because Afghanistan is in dire need for help, for investment, for aid. Already when the United States were present and they answered for 75 to 80% of the Afghan budget. Already in 2020, the situation was of almost half the country living under the poverty line, with unemployment actually above 10%, you know, at around 11% in 2020, let's say, and very low payments. You know, 35% of the working force receiving less than $1.9 a day. And another indicator was child mortality. You know, 6% of newborn children died before the age of 5. That's you know, a very difficult situation already, with the U.S. Channeling so much funds into the country. Now, with the U.S. withdrawal, there's no perspective for any country or group of countries managing to really fill the gap as a whole, although a few countries do engage, very few actually at this moment. China has promised a $31 million aid to Afghanistan, including COVID vaccines. Qatar has also been funneling aid, and Pakistan. Russia also engages with the new Afghan government in a different sense, probably not with the same aspect at all as China will. With Chinese interests really being on a very high level inside Afghanistan, mineral exploitation, the whole economic project of China for the region will include Afghanistan for sure. But it would be very difficult to not see the country at this moment, in this stage, face a very dire situation, and the population facing probably famine. In unprecedented rates, actually. And this really leads us to a few last considerations, Tristan, because on the one hand, the Taliban had already been engaging with the flow and guaranteeing the flow of aid to several regions that were under its control throughout the past 20 years. So why cannot this continue happening? The second thing, which is also very cynical in all this, from my point of view, is that although it is so important to to uphold groups that are working for human rights and women activists and women active on the internet, on the social media, and upholding their rights, and not isolate the Afghan people, those who are defending their own conquests in terms of human rights and so forth. So although it's really important to have this in mind, to keep engaging with these people, not forget them at this moment, it's also very cynical that suddenly the West will not engage with this government. If you compare this to the engagement Western countries, European, United States have with Saudi Arabia, for example, which is equally or even more aggressive towards human rights in the region. So finally, all these indicators tend to show, to draw a scenario in which it's very difficult to see a Taliban ceding to pressures that will possibly try to channel through humanitarian aid. Second, sanctions would probably work even worse in trying to, uphold certain aspects of this government of respect to human rights. So sanctions have never worked in the past, didn't work towards Saddam Hussein, who got stronger and stronger while those were upheld. And Iran is another example. Also, with the comparison with Iran, I think we should remember that the assets that the US have frozen from the Taliban, 10 billion US dollars that mainly from the Afghan central bank that are frozen, they already work as sanctions. It's a type of pressure and the US has clearly said that it will depend on the Afghan government to build the trust to be able to unfreeze these assets. But if we compare this to the Iranian case, after the Islamic Revolution in 1979, Iran also had millions in US dollars frozen for decades. So this could also in Afghanistan go on for decades and decades. So all this really builds up to a situation in which the population is the one that has to lose, is the one that is being victimized in the end for the situation. And the government could hardly at this moment be effectively motivated to change, to implement a government based on human rights and for the respect for international law because of any kind of promise of international aid and donors and funding and so on.
So the Taliban have regrouped and stayed together for the last 20 years, despite an intense crackdown on an enormous array of ineffections. There's been a generational replacement of sorts. Some analysts claim this has to do, among other factors, with this narrative of a small resistance fighting against an all-powerful oppressive invader. And while it is true that with US backing we've seen a blossoming cosmopolitanism in cities like Kabul, war has claimed the lives of countless civilians over the years in all of the country. If we know foreign intervention's been key for the Taliban's historical development and their return to power, my question is, while we strongly condemn the rise of this authoritarian extremist regime, do you not think it's oversimplistic and kind of hypocritical to brand them as an illegitimate government? After all that's happened in the last 20 years, how can we interpret Taliban legitimacy in modern-day Afghanistan, Arlene?
You see, the US had a motive, an argument to invade Afghanistan in 2001. But in fact, they did this as an act of vengeance, not as a consequential strategy to combat terrorism. And then, even after the fall of Taliban, which happened reasonably quickly, as part of a foreign policy strategy to try to reshape the region as a whole, they stayed for the 20 years, and this has failed terribly. So on top of this, the methods that were implemented to withhold the military occupation, including all that came with it, the whole structure that came with it. This included methods such as night raids into villages, tortures, targeted killings, and then finally the drone attacks, which victimized so many innocent civilians, bystanders, women, children. And even when, let's say, infrastructure building began to really flow in larger numbers, such as under the President Barack Obama, it reached regions where revolt, distress, anxiety had already reached such high levels because of all the destruction that came with the U.S. military occupation and the drone strikes. It was, absolutely ineffective. It was just too late to kind of say, okay, look, we're going to build new perspectives, life perspectives, investment, institution. All this was very, very timid, and in face of the destruction built was really, almost irrelevant for the people. So it could not in any way prevent the tendency of young men joining the ranks of the Taliban resistance. And, you could say, well, didn't the US know of this? Well, it did. But to some degree, it viewed this as manageable, as part of a process, and to a large extent, it downplayed this aspect of the whole thing by, or let's say thanks or due to a system of intelligence that was designed to justify occupation and to create the idea that things were heading in the right direction when they were not. And so the first aspect of this is that, the US occupation itself created the setting, the conditions, the revolt and anxiety, distress that channeled and so many to join the resistance, the Taliban. Other groups also, but the main group here, we're talking about the Taliban. The second aspect that made the Taliban resistance gain legitimacy in the eyes of many in the country was the corruption of the US-backed Afghan government. Its corruption, also the fact that it also included notorious war criminals, authoritarian leaders of the old patriarchal tradition, which itself had a long history of human rights abuses against women's rights on its backs. The third aspect that directly conferred legitimacy to the Taliban was the fact that, all this time it was guaranteeing what I had mentioned earlier, the flow of aid to people and regions under its control or influence. You could say that only in the last period, 30% of the country was, under uncontested government control. So dealing with the Taliban and the Taliban creating and guaranteeing the flow of assistance to the regions was crucial. So all this helps to explain how the Taliban rebuilt itself in the past decades, gained this role, this place as a force of resistance. But I would also say that it's probably not enough to uphold the new government. So legitimacy will have to be gained anew as a government, or it will be a repressive authoritarian rule. And over a population that exists extremely diversified, large sectors of the middle class have upheld roles in government, in institutions, in universities, will be will be a force of opposition. Even if it is silence for a long period, it will be a considerable force to deal with for the Taliban. And therefore, if it does not regain its legitimacy as the government, from scrap, from zero, it will only be able to uphold itself as a very authoritarian rule, and that will not be a legitimate government for sure.
Some analysts compare the withdrawal's fiasco to the US defeat at the end of the Vietnam War. But there are top US Army officials that have claimed both Trump and Biden were advised against it. Has anything really changed with US foreign policy, though? Does this withdrawal send at all a message to US allies and foes in the region, or could it even be the end for the international war on terror as we know it?
Well, the war on terror has really changed the world as we knew it. Well, we're really living in what has come out of the war on terror, on these 2 decades of foreign US policy. Not only did it lead to decades of military occupation of the Middle East and a huge boom in the military industry, military contractors, and so forth, but also inside the US, inside European countries, this whole idea of the fear of a menacing, penetrating, almost invisible other that has been fabricated or extremely augmented after the attack of 9/11, which of course was quite real. But after all this came about, the US policy has built on this idea of an impending threat, fear, of urgency, that has an idea of an urgency that's been created upon all this. And this has been used to justify the authoritarian transformation of fundamental democratic institutions, not in the Middle East, but inside these countries themselves, the USA, European countries, the European Union, in the judiciary, the prisonal system, and also this absolute rise of the surveillance, justified in the name of protection, of the need to protect oneself against this, created idea of a huge imminent threat. So this also included an almost schizophrenic shutting out of immigrants in countries, by the way, such as the US, that were precisely built upon the historical flow of immigrants. So today, the war on terror, it has not ended in any way. I mean, what ended in terms was foreign occupation so far. That was what ended, and that was exactly what Biden announced in his speech on the final moments of withdrawal that was going to end, and that was what has changed. It's foreign occupation, which is so costly and brings about so many complicated consequences. But the war on terror as a strategy, as a justification, it has not, as a policy, it has not ended. And it has left us with a very worrying corrosion of democratic institutions in Western countries and a new rise in authoritarian regimes, groups, tendencies in the Middle East. So, I mean, the striking image, if we remember those final days of the US presence in Afghanistan, the striking image that best represents the war on terror for the regular Afghan, there were not so much those US planes taking off or even, the people trying to escape, the atrocities that happened together with that, such as that terrible, mortal ISIS-K suicide attack, or those tense moments, people clinging onto airplanes. Those images were very strong. But the image of the war on terror, and which was reiterated at the very last moment, was that one drone attack, one more drone attack filled with vengeance, just like so many other drone attacks, killing an innocent father, 7 children, and leaving a hopeless mother, one sister, to grieve, for the rest of their lives what happened that day, based on absolutely flawed so-called intelligence. So that was, the paradigmatic, let's say, image of what the war on terror has meant both for the Middle East and for the country that launched it and still has not changed, has not reverted this tendency in any profound way. So, and precisely Biden promised to continue dealing with the threat of terrorism from the outside. With what he called, the help of intelligence, so this flawed intelligence, drone attacks, these terrible drone attacks. So this doesn't really change fundamentally the situation, not in the Middle East, which from which the U.S. is withdrawing as a whole, or inside the United States or other democratic countries that have been partners with the U.S. in all this. And you asked about the message. The best message this leaves is that anyone in the region would be better off avoiding the United States engagement altogether. It has brought very many problems together with it, other than financing and yes, creating conditions for the study of women and so on. We cannot deny all this, but I also tend to look at these conquests in terms of human rights, women's rights, as historical, 1 century long conquests that were achieved by the people in Middle Eastern countries, Arab or Islamic countries. In the 1920s there was an important feminist movement in Egypt and other countries. In the same period, there were important movements, for and defending and discussing the freedom of ideas, of speech, of representation. Books being written against authoritarian rule, like by Kawakibi, the Syrian intellectual of the beginning of the 20th century. And the same goes for Afghanistan. So these tendencies, of the people in the region asking, demanding, and building their own movement for rights, for freedoms, and so forth, it has not been taken to the region by the U.S., even if, to a small extent, the U.S. presence and the U.S.-backed government have permitted, schooling for women. But this is not the whole picture. The whole picture is actually something much deeper, and it is what we've been talking about. It's about fomenting and giving legitimacy and building up and rebuilding the resistance against U.S. and Western presence in general, which finally has been, taken on by the Taliban itself and by other radical or authoritarian groups. So at this moment, when the U.S. ends its last important occupation in the Middle East, leaving, by the way, one occupation intact, which is the Israeli occupation of Palestine, which one can say is like the last one that is being upheld in the region. At this moment, when it's shifting its concerns to East Asia, that's what the U.S. is concerned about now. That's where it's focusing its attention on. So hopefully this may bring an opportunity at the end of the day for the Middle East. But I think we must say that the deficit in terms of economic development, the presence of authoritarian tendencies that are in deep dispute with the democratic tendencies, with the people tendency, people power in many ways. Now, this is all immense. It's really a big, huge struggle, but hopefully it will have an opportunity now to develop in a more positive way, we could say. And finally, it is, as you mentioned, a historical deficit from 200 years of Western colonialism. And it's in that big picture that we have to really understand and see where we stand at this moment.
Thank you very much for joining us, Arlene. And that's that for this edition. There will be a new edition of CAF's podcast next month. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, send us an email. The address is caf@commonactionforum.net. I am Tristan Torjon. This edition was produced by the Common Action Forum team in Madrid, thanks to Irene Lopez and Sofia Golke. Special thanks to Dr. Arlene Clemesha for joining us today, and overall, thank you for listening. Until next time.